the seduction of power. There is a transformation that occurs in the human soul when power enters it, a metamorphosis so subtle and so profound that most people do not notice it happening to themselves. They believe they remain who they always were, that their core values persist, that power is merely a tool they now possess. But something ancient and dangerous awakens when we gain the ability to impose our will upon the world, to bend reality to our preferences, to make others comply with our desires. Lord Acton's famous dictum haunts us across the centuries. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But what exactly corrupts, and why? Is corruption inevitable, written into the structure of power itself? Or is it a failure of character, a weakness that reveals what was always lurking beneath the surface? These questions are not academic. They cut to the heart of what it means to be human in a world where power exists, where hierarchies form, where some command and others obey. History is littered with the wreckage of those who believed themselves immune to corruption, leaders who began with noble intentions, revolutionaries who fought against tyranny only to become tyrants themselves, reformers who promised to drain the swamp but drowned in it. We watch this pattern repeat across cultures and centuries. Yet, each generation believes it will be different, that they will be the exception, that their power will remain pure. But power does not corrupt from the outside. It does not impose itself upon an unwilling soul. It reveals what was hidden, amplifies what was suppressed, gives permission to what was forbidden. Power is a mirror that shows us who we truly are, when the constraints are removed, when no one can stop us, when we no longer need to pretend. The psychology of power is the psychology of the human soul stripped bare. The nature of power, psychological foundations. To understand how power corrupts, we must first understand what power is. At its most fundamental level, power is the capacity to produce effects in the world, to make things happen, to alter the course of events according to our will. But human power is never simply mechanical. It is always relational. It exists in the space between people, in the dynamics of influence, control, submission, and resistance. The philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote that power is the fundamental concept in social science, just as energy is the fundamental concept in physics. But unlike energy, which operates according to impersonal laws, power operates through human psychology, through our deepest needs and our darkest capacities. Power flows through the channels of our fears, our desires, our shame, our hunger for recognition, and our terror of insignificance. There are multiple forms of power, and each corrupts in its own way. There is coercive power, the ability to punish and reward, to threaten and incentivize. There is legitimate power, granted by social structures and institutions, the power of office and position. There is expert power derived from knowledge and competence. There is referent power, the influence that comes from being admired or loved. And there is informational power, the control of knowledge and narrative, perhaps the most insidious form in our current age. But beneath all these forms lies something more primal. Power satisfies fundamental psychological needs that have their roots in our evolutionary history. In the ancestral environment, status and dominance determined access to resources, to mates, to survival itself. Natural selection favored those who were sensitive to hierarchies, who could navigate social dominance, who desired status and the power it brought. This hunger for power is not a corruption of human nature. It is human nature. Yet here we encounter the first great paradox of power, the very thing that drives us to seek power. This evolutionary hunger for status and control also makes us vulnerable to its corrupting influence. We do not seek power neutrally, as we might seek a tool. We seek it desperately, hungrily, because it promises to satisfy needs so deep we often cannot name them. The need to matter, the need to be seen, the need to escape the terror of powerlessness, of vulnerability, of being at the mercy of forces we cannot control. Power and the shadow, Jungian perspective. Carl Jung understood that every human being contains the full spectrum of human possibility, including the capacity for tyranny, for cruelty, for the abuse of power. This capacity lives in what he called the shadow, that part of the psyche containing everything we have disowned, everything we refuse to acknowledge about ourselves. And nothing brings the shadow to the surface quite like power. In ordinary life, we are constrained. Social norms, laws, consequences, the judgments of others, all these forces shape our behavior, forcing us to suppress certain impulses, to hide certain desires. We learn to be civilized, to control our aggression, to mask our selfishness, to pretend to care about others when often we care primarily about ourselves. These constraints are not merely external, we internalize them, creating what Jung called the persona, the acceptable face we show to the world. But power removes constraints. It says, you can do what you want. No one can stop you. You do not need to pretend anymore. And in that moment of liberation, the shadow emerges. The tyrannical impulses we swore we did not have, the cruelty we claimed was foreign to our nature, the selfishness we insisted we had transcended, all of it comes roaring out of the darkness. This is why power does not corrupt in the sense of making us into something we were not. It reveals what we always were, but lacked the opportunity to express. The person who becomes a tyrant when given power was always a potential tyrant. The difference is that now the potential can actualize. The shadow can act. Jung wrote extensively about the dangers of identifying with power archetypes, particularly the king or the tyrant. When we gain power, we risk inflating, losing our individual humanity, and becoming possessed by the archetype. We are no longer John or Mary who happens to have authority. We are the authority. We are the leader. We are the one who decides. This inflation is a form of psychological possession. The ego identifies with the power it wields and begins to believe it is the source of that power rather than merely its temporary vehicle. The inflated ego loses touch with its own limitations, its own humanity, its own capacity for error. It begins to believe its own mythology. Every success confirms its specialness. Every criticism becomes evidence of the critic's deficiency rather than the leader's flaw. Feedback loops close. Reality becomes whatever the powerful person says it is. This is not merely arrogance. It is a fundamental alteration in how the psyche relates to truth. Consider what happens psychologically when someone gains significant power. They are surrounded by people who tell them what they want to hear. Disagreement becomes dangerous for subordinates, so it disappears. The powerful person's every casual opinion is treated as profound wisdom. Their jokes are hilarious. Their ideas are brilliant. Every meeting confirms their superiority, and slowly, imperceptibly, they begin to believe it. This is the mechanism of corruption. Not a sudden turn to evil, but a gradual erosion of the capacity for self-reflection, for doubt, for recognizing one's own limitations. Power creates an echo chamber of the self, and in that chamber, the shadow grows unchecked, feeding on praise and the absence of resistance. The corrupting mechanism. Why good people turn bad. The question that haunts moral philosophy is this: why do good people, people with genuine intentions, people who sincerely want to help, why do they so often become corrupted when they gain power? The answer lies not in their initial moral failings, but in the psychological mechanisms that power activates. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, revealed something terrifying about human nature. Ordinary college students, randomly assigned to play guards in a simulated prison, began abusing their power within days. The humiliated prisoners stripped them of dignity, imposed arbitrary and cruel punishments. These were not bad people. They were normal, psychologically healthy individuals who, when given power over others in a context that legitimized that power, became sadistic. Zimbardo's work, along with Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, showed that situational forces can overwhelm individual character, But the mechanism is more subtle than simply saying the situation made them do it. What happens is that power provides both permission and distance. Permission to act on impulses that civility normally suppresses, and distance from the humanity of those affected by our actions. When we have power over others, they cease to be fully real to us in the same way. They become objects, obstacles, tools, resources. Neuroscience has confirmed this. Brain imaging studies show that when people are placed in positions of power, their capacity for empathy decreases. The neural circuits involved in perspective taking, in imagining what others feel, become less active. This is not a conscious choice. It happens automatically, beneath awareness. Power literally changes how we perceive other human beings. The powerful show reduced activation in mirror neurons, the systems that allow us to feel what others feel. They become less able to read emotions accurately in others' faces. They interrupt more in conversations. They take more food from communal plates. They are more likely to cheat, to lie, to break rules they expect others to follow. Not because they decided to become immoral, but because their perception of reality has shifted. This is the corrupting mechanism. Power does not tempt us with obvious evil. It alters our capacity to recognize evil in our own actions. It creates moral blindness. We genuinely believe we are acting for good reasons, that our harsh treatment of subordinates is necessary discipline, that our accumulation of privileges is deserved, that our bending of rules is justified by the importance of our mission. The psychologist Dr. Keltner calls this the power paradox. The qualities that help people gain power, empathy, collaboration, fairness, listening to others, are the exact qualities that power diminishes. We rise through connection and fall through isolation. We gain influence by understanding others and lose it by becoming blind to them. Power contains within itself the seeds of its own corruption and eventual downfall. But there is something even more insidious at work. Power does not simply reduce empathy. It provides justifications, narratives that make corruption feel like virtue. Every tyrant believes they are serving a higher good. Every corrupt leader has a story in which they are the hero. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense of knowing you are wrong but pretending otherwise. It is self-deception so complete that the distinction between pretending and believing dissolves. The philosopher Hannah Arendt, studying the Nazi regime, expected to find monsters. Instead, she found bureaucrats, ordinary people who committed extraordinary evil while genuinely believing they were doing their duty. She called it the banality of evil. But it is more than banal. It is terrifying. It means that corruption does not require us to become something alien to ourselves. We can commit atrocities while remaining, in our own minds, decent people doing difficult but necessary work. This mechanism operates at every level of power, not just in totalitarian regimes. The manager who creates a toxic workplace believes they are maintaining high standards. The CEO who exploits workers believes they are creating value. The politician who lies believes they are serving the greater good. Power provides the narrative framework that transforms exploitation into leadership, cruelty into toughness, selfishness into vision, power and identity, existential transformation. Friedrich Nietzsche understood power differently than most philosophers. He saw the will to power not as a corruption of human nature, but as its fundamental drive. For Nietzsche, the question was not whether to seek power, but how to wield it. Whether power would master us or we would master it. Whether we would use it to create or to destroy. Nietzsche distinguished between what he called master morality and slave morality. Master morality is the ethics of the powerful, who define good as whatever affirms life, strength, creativity. Slave morality is the ethics of the powerless, who define good as whatever constrains power, as humility, equality, compassion. Nietzsche saw slave morality as resentment disguised as virtue, the revenge of the weak against the strong. But Nietzsche also recognized the danger of power without wisdom, strength without self-overcoming. His concept of the Übermensch, the overman, is not simply the powerful person, but the one who has power over themselves first, who uses power to create rather than merely to dominate. The corruption of power occurs when we seek power over others as a substitute for power over ourselves, when external dominance compensates for internal weakness. The existentialists saw clearly that power transforms identity. Sartre wrote that we are condemned to be free, condemned to choose who we will become. But power narrows the range of genuine choice. When you have power, certain options disappear. You cannot be both the king and the commoner. You cannot wield authority and maintain the innocence of powerlessness. Power forces you into a role, and the role begins to consume the person who plays it. This is the existential corruption of power. It is not simply that power makes us cruel or selfish. It is that power requires us to become something other than what we were, and that transformation is often irreversible. The revolutionary who becomes the ruler cannot return to being the revolutionary. Power changes not just what we do, but who we are. It alters the fundamental structure of identity. Before power, we might have been flexible, uncertain, multiple selves trying different possibilities. But power demands consistency, demands that we become a singular thing that can be relied upon to act predictably within the role. The CEO must be the CEO. The general must be the general. The judge must be the judge. Kierkegaard wrote about the despair of willing to be oneself versus the despair of not willing to be oneself. But power introduces a third despair, the despair of being forced to be a self that is not truly oneself but is demanded by the role. We become imprisoned in our own authority, unable to escape the person we have become, unable to admit doubt or weakness or uncertainty without threatening the entire structure of power that depends on our appearing infallible. This is why abdication is so rare and so difficult. It is not merely giving up power, it is destroying the identity that power has created. Who are you when you are no longer the powerful person? The king who gives up the throne does not return to being whoever he was before. That person no longer exists. He becomes something new, something undefined. And this lack of definition is terrifying. The existential corruption of power is therefore this. It makes us less free, even as it appears to give us more freedom. We gain the freedom to impose our will on others, but lose the freedom to be anything other than the wielder of that will. We become trapped in our own dominance, prisoners of our own authority, unable to change or grow or question without destabilizing the entire edifice of power we have constructed. Consider the leader who has made a terrible mistake. To admit the error would be to show weakness, to undermine authority, to give ammunition to rivals. And so, the error cannot be admitted. It must be defended, justified, doubled down upon. More resources must be committed to proving that the wrong decision was right. More lies must be told to cover the original lie. The leader becomes enslaved to maintaining the appearance of infallibility, sacrificing truth to preserve power. This dynamic creates what psychologists call escalation of commitment. The more we invest in a failing course of action, the harder it becomes to change course. This is true for everyone, but power magnifies the effect catastrophically because the costs of admission are so high. The powerful person who admits error risks everything, and so error compounds upon error, each justified by the need to protect the authority necessary to impose the next error. The neuroscience and psychology of power. Modern neuroscience has begun to map the neural changes that occur when humans gain power, and what we discover confirms the ancient wisdom about corruption. Power does not simply provide new opportunities for bad behavior. It fundamentally alters brain function in ways that make bad behavior more likely and less visible to the person engaging in it. Research by Dr. Keltner and others has shown that power activates the behavioral approach system in the brain, the neural circuitry associated with reward seeking and reduced inhibition. When we have power, we become more focused on goals and rewards, more willing to take risks, and less constrained by social norms. This can be positive, allowing for decisive action and bold vision. But it also removes the internal brakes that prevent us from acting on selfish or harmful impulses. At the same time, power deactivates the behavioral inhibition system, the circuitry that makes us cautious, that helps us recognize threats and dangers, that keeps us attuned to social consequences. The powerful become less anxious about how others perceive them, which can be liberating but also dangerous. Without the fear of social judgment, we lose one of the primary mechanisms that keeps behavior ethical. Brain imaging studies reveal that power reduces activity in the mirror neuron system, the neural networks responsible for empathy and perspective taking. When subjects are primed to feel powerful, they show decreased ability to understand others' mental states, to imagine what others are thinking or feeling. This is not a conscious choice to be less empathetic. It is an automatic neural response to the experience of power. The powerful also show increased activity in reward centers when contemplating actions that benefit themselves, and decreased activity when contemplating actions that benefit others. Their brains literally find self-serving actions more rewarding and other-serving actions less rewarding. The neural machinery of morality recalibrates around the self. Perhaps most troubling is the effect of power on self-awareness. Studies using the Iowa gambling task show that powerful people become less able to learn from negative feedback, less able to recognize when their strategies are failing. They perseverate in losing strategies longer than those without power. Power creates a kind of cognitive rigidity, a decreased ability to update beliefs in response to evidence. This happens because power alters the relationship between the prefrontal cortex, which handles executive function and self-regulation, and the limbic system, which processes emotions and rewards. The prefrontal cortex normally inhibits impulsive behavior, helping us consider consequences and align actions with values. But chronic power appears to weaken prefrontal control, allowing limbic drives to dominate decision-making. The neurochemistry of power is equally revealing. Power increases testosterone and decreases cortisol, creating a biochemical state of high confidence and low stress. This sounds positive, but the combination can be dangerous. High testosterone increases dominance behaviors, risk-taking, and aggression. Low cortisol reduces anxiety about consequences. Together, they create a state of fearless dominance that can manifest as leadership, but also as recklessness and cruelty. Serotonin levels also increase with status and power, generally producing positive mood and reduced impulsivity. But chronic elevation of serotonin can lead to decreased sensitivity to social feedback, making powerful people less responsive to signs that they are harming others or making mistakes. The very neurochemicals that make power feel good also make its wielders blind to its corrupting effects. The neuroscience of power reveals something profound. Corruption is not primarily a moral failure, but a predictable consequence of how power affects the brain. The person who becomes corrupt often does not choose corruption. Their brain, shaped by the experience of power, makes corruption feel like competence, exploitation feel like efficiency, cruelty feel like strength. Beyond corruption, conscious use of power. If power corrupts so predictably, if its effects are written into our neurobiology and our psychology, then what hope exists for wielding power ethically? This is not an academic question. Power exists. Hierarchies form. Some must lead, while others follow. The question is not whether power will be wielded, but whether it can be wielded consciously, with awareness of its corrupting potential, with safeguards against its worst effects. The first requirement for ethical power is the recognition that you are not immune. The moment you believe corruption happens to other people, to weaker people, to less moral people, you have already begun the process of corruption. Humility is not weakness. It is accurate perception of reality. You are human. You contain the same shadow, the same capacity for tyranny, the same vulnerability to the distortions that power creates. This recognition must be constant, renewed daily, or it fades into comfortable self-deception. The ancient Greeks understood this. They develop the concept of hubris, the excessive pride that comes from forgetting one's limitations, from believing oneself above the laws that govern ordinary mortals. Greek tragedy repeatedly shows powerful people destroyed by hubris, by the inflation that comes from identifying with power rather than remaining conscious of oneself as merely its temporary steward. The antidote to hubris is what they called sophrosyne, a kind of wise self-restraint, a remembering of one's mortality and limitation even in the midst of power. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, as Emperor of Rome, practiced this discipline obsessively. His meditations are a daily reminder to himself: you are human, you will die, your power is temporary, use it well, do not let it intoxicate you, he wrote. Be like the headland against which the waves continually break, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it. This is the stance of conscious power, firm but not rigid, strong but not cruel, aware of both the necessity of authority and its dangers. But individual discipline is not enough. Power must be structurally limited, checked by other powers, subjected to accountability that cannot be avoided or dismissed. The American founders understood this, creating a system of checks and balances precisely because they recognized that power corrupts. They did not rely on the virtue of leaders. They assumed leaders would become corrupt and built a system to constrain that corruption. This principle applies at every level. Leaders need advisors who can speak truth without fear of punishment. They need mechanisms for receiving feedback that cannot be filtered or controlled. They need regular reminders of their fallibility, their mortality, their commonality with those they lead. In ancient Rome, during triumphal processions, a slave stood behind the victorious general whispering, "Remember, you are mortal." This was not cruelty, it was wisdom institutionalized. The practice of power must also include what Jung called active imagination, a conscious dialogue with the shadow. The leader must regularly ask, what am I not seeing? What impulses am I justifying that I would condemn in others? Where am I lying to myself? What would I do if I thought I could get away with it? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they are necessary. The shadow does not disappear through moral righteousness. It must be acknowledged, faced, integrated. This integration requires genuine vulnerability, which seems antithetical to power. We imagine leaders must be strong, must never show weakness, must project confidence at all times. But this image creates the conditions for corruption. When leaders cannot be vulnerable, cannot admit uncertainty or error, they become trapped in the persona of infallibility. They lose access to feedback, to reality, to their own humanity. Some leaders manage this by maintaining relationships outside the power structure. Friendships where they are not the leader, but simply a person. Others practice disciplines that remind them of their ordinariness. Manual labor, artistic creation, spiritual practice. The specific method matters less than the principle. Power must not be allowed to consume the entire identity. There must be spaces where you are not powerful, where you are subject to forces you cannot control, where you remember what it feels like to be vulnerable. The conscious use of power also requires what the Stoics called the view from above, the ability to see one's life and choices from a broader perspective. What will you think of these decisions in 10 years? How will they look when you no longer hold power? What would you once said about how you wielded authority when you are gone? These questions create psychological distance from the immediate intoxication of power. There is also the practice of deliberately choosing difficulty, of not using power simply because you can. Every time you have the power to impose your will but choose restraint, you strengthen the capacity for self-control. Every time you have the power to punish but choose mercy, you maintain connection to compassion. Every time you have the power to take but choose to give, you preserve the neural pathways of reciprocity and generosity that power tends to erode. Nietzsche wrote of the will to power not as domination but as self-overcoming, as the drive to become more than you currently are. The highest form of power is power over oneself, the ability to direct your own becoming, to shape your character deliberately rather than being shaped by circumstance. This self-mastery is what allows for ethical exercise of external power. The person who cannot master themselves will inevitably abuse mastery over others. But we must also be realistic. Power will corrupt. Even with all these practices, even with awareness and discipline and structural constraints, some corruption is inevitable. The question becomes, how much, how quickly, and can it be recognized and corrected before it becomes catastrophic? This is not defeat. This is wisdom. We aim not for perfect leaders, but for systems that can survive imperfect ones, for cultures that recognize corruption early, for mechanisms that allow for course correction. Conclusion: the psychology of power reveals us to ourselves in the harshest light. It shows that the capacity for tyranny, for cruelty, for the exploitation of others, lives not in some separate class of evil people, but in ordinary human psychology, activated by the experience of having power over others. This is not pessimism, it is realism, and realism is the foundation of any genuine ethics of power. We cannot eliminate power. It is woven into the fabric of human social life. Hierarchies emerge. Some lead while others follow. Resources are distributed unequally. These are facts of existence. But we can choose how we relate to power, whether we wield it with consciousness or allow it to wield us, whether we recognize its corrupting influence or succumb to the illusion of our own immunity. The corrupting mechanism is predictable. Power reduces empathy, increases self-serving bias, creates echo chambers that reinforce the leader's existing beliefs, provides narratives that justify exploitation as necessity. These are not individual moral failures, but systemic effects of power on human psychology and neurology. Knowing this, we can build defenses. The defense against corruption is not virtue in the simple sense. It is structural limitation, psychological discipline, maintained vulnerability, conscious dialogue with the shadow, regular reminding of mortality and limitation. It is the practice of power as service rather than privilege, as responsibility rather than right, as something that must be constantly justified rather than simply enjoyed. Jung taught that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. This is nowhere more true than with power. The leader who does not consciously examine their relationship to power, who does not face their own capacity for corruption, who does not build safeguards against their own worst impulses, will be consumed by what they refuse to see. They will become the tyrant they swore they would never be, and they will genuinely believe they are acting for the good. But consciousness offers another possibility. The leader who knows they can be corrupted, who watches for the signs, who maintains structures that limit their own power, who preserves relationships that remind them of their humanity, who practices restraint even when they could act with impunity, this leader has a chance. Not certainty, not immunity, but a chance to wield power without being destroyed by it, to serve without becoming a servant of their own ego, to lead without losing their soul. This is the challenge and the opportunity. Power will always exist. The question is whether we will face what it does to us, whether we will build systems and practices that constrain its worst effects, whether we will choose consciousness over comfort, truth over the seductive lies that power whispers. The soul that power corrupts is not fundamentally different from any other soul. It is simply a soul given the opportunity to act on impulses that others must suppress, to indulge narcissism that others must disguise, to escape consequences that others must face. What corrupts is not power itself, but the illusion that power creates, that we are different, special, exempt from the laws that govern ordinary humans. The antidote is remembering, you are human, you will die, your power is temporary, use it well. This remembering must be daily, must be built into structures, must be maintained through discipline and practice, and the willingness to face what we would prefer to deny. We are all vulnerable to the corruption of power. Some of us will wield power over many. Others will wield it only in small domains, over children or employees or students. But the mechanism is the same. The question is the same. Will we face it? Or will we become another example of the pattern we swore we would break? Another cautionary tale of good intentions corrupted? Another soul lost to the seduction of dominance? The choice, ultimately, is consciousness or fate. And that choice must be made again and again, moment by moment, for as long as power remains in our hands. Call to action. If this exploration has challenged you to think differently about power, about your own relationship to authority and control, then you have begun the work of consciousness. Power exists in your life, whether you acknowledge it or not. The question is whether you will examine it honestly. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that does not offer comfortable answers but invites difficult questions, that explores the depths of human psychology with unflinching honesty. Share this with someone in a position of power who might benefit from this reflection, or with someone seeking to understand why power changes people. Leave a comment sharing your own observations about power and its effects, your own struggles with authority, your own witnessing of corruption or conscious leadership. This community exists for those willing to face uncomfortable truths about human nature, including their own. We are all capable of corruption. We all contain the shadow. The work is not to deny this, but to bring it into consciousness, to build lives and systems that acknowledge our vulnerability and protect against our worst impulses. Remember, the powerful rarely see their own corruption. It is others who must witness it, must speak it, must build the structures that limit it. If you see corruption, you have a responsibility. If you wield power, you have a greater one. We are in this together. All of us navigating the dangerous territory where human psychology meets the ability to impose our will upon the world.